and I forgot what his name was, but Rabbi Schwartz. So they used to introduce him as the late Rabbi Schwartz. So I hope you don't introduce me as the late Rabbi Stavsky, not for a while. So it's good to see everybody. Again, I'm sorry. Hope everybody had a wonderful Purim, and thank you for the Shalach Manos. And I don't know who wrote that beautiful message on the mug. It was a beautiful message, and it was heartwarming. And
we stole it off the internet.
Everything's stolen off the internet. Okay, well, thank you. You stole well, so thank you. And hope everyone had an enjoyable, different than usual, but an enjoyable Purim, and wherever you were. I wanted to talk this week and start with a writing of the Rambam, which is a famous writing, one of his famous letters. And it's he wrote in his younger years. It's not that long of a letter, and I didn't. It's not something I'm able really to put on. I guess I could have worked if I to put it on the screen. So I'm just gonna talk about it and maybe read you small parts of it. But there's something called Igeret Hashmad. Igeret Hashmad of the Rambam. I don't know how we would translate the letter of it's apostasy, or I don't know how it's translated exactly in English.
Forced conversion. The letter about forced conversion.
The letter about forced conversion, yeah. It's sometimes the title is Ma'amar Kiddush Hashem, or Igeret Hashmad, or apostasy, or forced conversion, and it's a very well known letter of the Rambam. And the Rambam, as we said, he has three major works. One is his commentary on the Mishnah, on all of Mishnah. Included in that are his introductions to certain parts of the Mishnah. Some we've studied, like his introduction to Pirkei Avot. His second major work, and maybe his major work, is Mishnah Torah, which is his book on Yad HaChazaka, all of Halacha. And the third major work is his philosophical work, Moreh Nevuchim, Guide for the Perplexed, which are, I guess, known as the three major works of the Rambam. But there were many letters and other things which he wrote, which are telling about the time in which the Rambam lived, and also telling about his personality and who he was. And I'm not a Rambam expert, and I'm not a history expert, but what's interesting, this letter Igeret Hashmad is very telling and very important, and we see the different aspects of the Rambam's personality in this letter. Let me give you just a few moments of context, of historical context to this letter. The Rambam was born there's some question about his date of birth. It was in the 1100s, 1130s, 1135, according to some, 1136. It was generally, I think, the date, if you look it up somewhere, it'll say 1135, I think, was when the Rambam was born. A brief biography. He was born to a rabbinic family. We're talking about the Rambam, Maimonides, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, who lived before the Ramban, Nachmanides, lived slightly later, also a Rishon, but in the 1200s. But the Rambam was born into a rabbinic family. He came from a family apparently with the name Obadiah for generations. And his father, Rabbi Maimon, was a Rav, as was his father before him, going back generations. And he traced his lineage back, and he talks about his lineage and his family yichus at the end of his introduction to the Mishnah, to Perush HaMishnayot, where he goes through the Masorah, and he also talks about his family lineage. So here's where the Ramban, he was a young man, he was born in Spain, and the family, the Rambam and his family, during those years, the persecution, his younger years, there were the Almohades, who were basically their mantra was the Koran or the sword, where basically it was a time of forced conversions. It was not an easy time for Jews in that period in the 1170s, 1180s, and he fled originally with his family, with his father, Rabbi Maimon. He had a brother, which I'll talk about also, Rabbi David. The Rambam was very close with his brother, Rabbi David ben Maimon, and he was Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. And his father and his family and his mother, obviously, is not a lot written about that he writes about his mother, but that they fled from Spain to Morocco, to Fez in Morocco. And they spent it's unclear, about 3 to 5 years in Morocco. After that, and again, it was not a place really it was going from the frying pan into the fire. It was not much better in Morocco in those years than it was in Spain. From North Africa, from Morocco, the family made a long and arduous journey to Israel. They landed in Akko in the month of Iyar. They landed in Akko. They spent a few months in Akko. And then the Rambam writes very emotionally how they made their way, and he went to visit Yerushalayim and Hebron. The situation that the Jews had it there at that time in Israel was from the richness of Spain, even though it was there was persecution, the richness in thought. In Israel at that time, there was a paucity of intellectual thought and growth. And they spent, after a year, the Rambam made his way again, Spain, Morocco, Israel for about a year, and then to Egypt, where he moved, and there were different communities in Egypt. He ended up in Fostat, where he also learned some ways along the lines, the Rambam, medicine, and where he became a physician to Saladin in Egypt, where he spent his days and died, and of course was brought for Kavura, where he's buried now. We can go there. I'm sure most of us have been there, in Tiberia, to the Rambam's resting place. He and his father, Maimon, in Tiberia, the Rambam's kever. The Rambam lived again for the most of those years later in Egypt, and it was there he had a deal with his brother, who was not who was a learned fellow, but basically he was the businessman in the family, and he supported the Rambam, and his brother unfortunately died on a business journey, far away. I forgot what the coast of India or wherever it was, where his boat was capsized and he drowned, along with merchandise. Also, apparently, they dealt in precious gems, and his death. The Rambam writes about it. He apparently was very close with his brother. And he writes how he was really thrown for a loop and very, depressed, but sick in bed for a long time over the death of his brother, Rabbi David ben Maimon. That's the Rambam's life. Igeret Hashmad was written in the earlier part of his life. He wrote, for the most part, he started writing even when he was in Morocco, apparently, or possibly in Spain. He began as a young man writing the commentary on Mishnah, and he didn't complete it until he was in Egypt, till a little later on. But at this time when he was in Spain and in Morocco, he was in his early 20s. You're talking about a man who's maybe 25, and he's in Morocco. Now, there's the persecutions against the Jews, the certain brand of Muslims at that time were, and sometimes they were actually very tolerant, more tolerant than the Christians to other religions. And sometimes they were less tolerant, and they were less tolerant during these times. And there were, the forced conversions were basically, they were forcing those Jews, possibly Christians as well, they had made them recite basically a formula, or Quranic or a Muslim formula proclaiming that Muhammad is the prophet of God, and you have to follow him, and upon penalty of death if someone is not willing to do that. And that was really what the Jews were subject to in these places in Spain and in Morocco at those times. At that time, the Rambam's father, Rabbi Maimon, wrote a letter, and he was a leader, had been a leader and a respected, a known person, a letter of a Mechtav or Igeret HaNechama. It's called in English the letter of consolation, where he basically tried to strengthen and give hope and historical perspective to the suffering that we're going through, urging people to be strong even in these difficult times and times when people are subject to these threats and to death and to torture. And at that time, there was someone, and it's not known who this person was, but there was someone who circulated a letter at that time which threw the Jewish communities into a tizzy. And basically this letter that this anonymous rabbi wrote, and they don't know, and to this day, I'm sure there's speculation, and again, I'm not a historian, but it's, the sources that I looked into, and I studied this Rambam. I have a 2-volume set called Igeret HaRamban, put out by Moshe Rav Kook. I think it's put out by Moshe Rav Kook. No, it's not. Where it's put out, it's Igarot HaRamban, the letters of the Rambam, excuse me, of Maimonides, and he says that the author of this anonymous letter was unknown, but basically this guy was a what you'd call, I guess, the different names that we call this guy. We call him a kanoi. He was a zealot. And he basically wrote that anybody who does this is not considered a Jew anymore. And if you go and you say this formula, which accepts Muhammad, or if you step into a mosque, then your prayers afterwards to God, even though, you say, oh, I'm still a Jew and I still believe in Hashem, it's worthless. God doesn't want it, and it's worthless, and it's not worth anything. And this was a letter which was circulated amongst Jewry. It put people, as you can imagine, who are between a rock and a hard place, in a place where they risk death and torture for themselves and their families, and it puts them in here. This rabbi, whoever it was, puts out a letter. Give me 1 second. Puts out a letter which basically says if you are weak and you do this and you give in any way, you are as a Jew, you're out of the club, basically. You're out. And the Rambam wrote a response, and the response is called Igeret Hashmad. It's a letter about this. And think about this. This is the Rambam, who is a man who is, as I said, maybe 25 years old. And he writes this letter, and I'm sure there are translations available, if, even to read it. It's a powerful letter, full with beauty and love for the Jewish people, at the same time filled with strength and power to really go up against, and he speaks with great strength against this letter and what this guy is writing, and basically saying he doesn't know what he's talking about. And for him to write things against the Jewish people is a chutzpah. I'm gonna read you and small parts, and basically arguing very strenuously that it's not so what he says. And you see that from the Rambam, what's interesting, the Rambam is often referred to, and sometimes even in his book, they have I don't know who coined this, or who was first to call the Rambam Hanesher HaGadol, the great eagle. But the Rambam is one of his kinuyim that he's referred to is Hanesher HaGadol, because a Nesher is protective with his wings, and he protects the Jewish people, but also has a fierceness and a strength. And the Rambam, as a young man, again, I stress this, as a young man, showed a power to stand up for what he felt was right, against what he felt was a terrible, terrible danger for the people, for the Jewish nation, to be subject to what this guy wrote. And he basically makes the following arguments, and I'll try briefly to again, without reading too much. He says that, and he starts off by saying, I'm sure a person has good intentions, but it's very weak. Ein lo tam. And he makes absolutely no sense. Afapi, he said a person, Ra'ul Adam lachmol al diburo yoter mechemlato al mamono. The Rambam says a person has to be so careful with his words, and you have to really watch your words. And therefore, the person lo yarbe badibur. Don't write so many. He said, apparently it was a lengthy thing that this person wrote also, this rabbi. And he said, you write a lot of words and you're not saying much. He was very sharp, almost caustic in his response to this guy. And at the same time, I have to say, very loving in his approach to the Jewish people. And therefore he says, we shouldn't fall into this foolishness. And to say that someone is who believes in Mohammed is denying this. One of the things that this person wrote is, if you say that you believe in Mohammed, you are kofar belokei Yisrael. You are kofar in the God of Israel. And the person brought a proof from a Gemara that says, Kol hamodeh ba'avodah zarah, anyone who admits in the validity of avodah zarah, ki kofer b'kol haTorah kula, it says if he's denying all of Torah. And he says the guy makes no distinction whether a person is doing it of his own free will or because he's forced to do it. He says, how does this person go write this without any distinction, without any recognition of the times and the circumstances, and that the person is, that we're living through? And now it's interesting, we don't have a copy. Now somebody's writing, now he doesn't address this here, but the Rambam writes in other places, as Judith writes, that that Islam, the Rambam was famous for saying it, it was not considered, the Rambam did not consider it avodah zarah. But he doesn't address that in this letter. Here he's addressing the fact that the I don't want to get too much into the question. Rambam, as you say, doesn't address it as avodah zarah. Jews are enjoined not to believe in what we call shituf. That even if you believe that, yes, God is God, but there's also somebody else involved. Also, whether it's Muhammad, it's not the belief in Muhammad as the prophet of God is, without getting into that halachically, how problematic it is, or if it's problematic, and if it's very problematic or just a little bit problematic. The Rambam's first argument is this is just, you can't compare something with the Gemara, just pull a thing out of the Gemara and say, oh, anybody who does this, it's like they deny God. It says you have to understand what the circumstances are. And he says, you know what, I figured, let me read a little bit more. Let me give this guy the benefit of the doubt. And he shows, and he reads more into it. And again, he quotes from what he says. And he quotes that this person wrote that anybody who does this is pasal le'edus, is a rasha, and their tefillot are not worth anything. And he says, you should know that this is completely wrong. I started saying, the Rambam, we only have this letter in Hebrew. It's pretty, we don't know what language he wrote it in. A lot of what the Rambam wrote, he wrote in Arabic. It's very possible and probable that the Rambam wrote this originally in Arabic also. The historians say this because they say it makes sense because he was writing it for the masses. He was writing it for regular people who spoke Arabic and didn't necessarily speak Hebrew. So they have various other things they point to say that it wasn't originally written in Hebrew. It was originally written in Arabic. What's interesting is that none of the Arabic original writings of this Igeret are preserved. Meaning the only things they were able to find from mostly from the Geniza in Cairo were Hebrew translations of this letter. And the speculation is, that he writes, and even though he writes, this stuff is wrong, and we don't believe in Islam, and he doesn't say complimentary things about Muhammad. So it could be the Arabic copies were, it was like read this and then destroy, then burn it. It wasn't preserved, the Arabic copies, because if the Arabic copies found their way into the hands of the Muslims or the reigning Muslims at the time, that would not have been a good situation. And then he says, let me explain what's wrong with what he's saying. And he starts off by giving a history lesson. And he says, listen, says the Rambam. He says, in the days before Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Jews were idol worshippers. The Jews were falling down to the lowest level. And if it wasn't for Yetziat Mitzrayim, we learn they would have fallen completely. So to say because anything happened, you did something wrong, so you're terrible, is just wrong. And the days of Eliyahu, he brings Kamo Ken Yisrael b'mei Eliyahu hayu kulam ovdei avodah zarah b'ratzon. They were all in the days of Eliyahu and Achav, except for 7,000 people. Many of the people turned to serve the Baal, avodah zarah. And the pasuk says that Eliyahu says, "V'sharti b'Yisrael shivat alafim." And if that's the case, what are you going to do? You're going to say something negative about all the Jews before they got to Har Sinai? You're going to say, I'll call you back. I'm Milton, I'll call you back. That you're going to say that they were all terrible. And if you look actually in Melachim, the Psukim are so beautiful. He says, the Rambam says this, the Rambam himself says this, Eliyahu ran away and he came to Chorev. He came to the place where the Torah is, the Torah was given. And Hashem said, what are you doing here? And he said, Kano kinesi l'Hashem Elokei tzvakot, ki azvu britcha b'nei Yisrael. I've come because I'm zealous and jealous because they've left your covenant, the Jewish people. And God says to him, the Medrash says, Amar lo, the Medrash is sort of filling in the blanks as it does sometimes. Shema Britcha, Did they break your covenant? Amar lo, no, that wasn't my covenant, but et mizbechotecha harasu. Eliyahu said, but they've destroyed your altars. Amar lo, so God said to Eliyahu, Shema mizbechotecha, was it your altars that they destroyed? The esneviecha haraguba charev, against going back to the pasuk, Eliyahu said to God, and they've killed your prophets. Amar lo, God said to him, Vare'ata kayam, but you're still around. Amar, so Eliyahu said, yeah, I'm only left, it's just me. I'm here because I'm zealous and jealous. This is Eliyahu Hanavi. Imagine Eliyahu Hanavi is saying, I'm a kanoi. Eliyahu is the malach of kanaut, and he's fighting for the sanctity of God's name. Hashiva HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem said to him, Ad she'ata melamed chova al Yisrael. Listen to what God says to Eliyahu. Before you come to bury the Jewish people, lelamed chova, to say something bad about the Jewish people, lo haya lecha lelamed chova al umot ha'olam. Why don't you go? You want to say something negative? Say something negative about the umot ha'olam. Don't come right away to say something negative about the Jewish people. And he goes on, the Rambam, and he says, go back to Damascus, and it says, lech shuv l'darkecha midbara Damascus. Go back to your place. Go back to Damascus. If anyone wants to look up, this is in Melachim Aleph, Perek Yud Tes, and read that chapter 19 in Melachim Aleph. You just, again, it's the Medrash gives is laharchiv, it gives fabric to the psukim. But you see Eliyahu at his most kanoi, Eliyahu Hanavi, was a good guy. And God is sort of saying, he says, I've come here because it's a terrible situation and I'm zealous and I'm jealous and I'm a kanoi. And God said, don't be so quick to condemn the Jewish people. Don't be so quick to condemn this Jewish people. And he says the same thing about Yeshayahu. The Rambam goes on in this letter. And he says that God, Yeshayahu says, and the Navi Yeshaya we know has very, very strong language condemning. Hoi, he says at the beginning of Isaiah, Yeshaya, Hoi goy chote am keved avon, a nation who's heavy in sin, and they're terrible sinners. And God says, and it says, Hine am temes vasayim anochi yoshev. I'm sitting in a midst of a nation who have unclean lips. And God says to him, and he's also punished. And the Yeshayahu continues, and again, the Medrash, the Gemara explains that Yeshayahu was punished. And according to the Gemara, Yeshayahu did not achieve atonement until his death, until he was murdered by Menashe. He did not achieve atonement for speaking Lashon Hara about the Jewish people. We know the story of Moshe Rabbeinu also, that his hand came out mitzorat kasheleg because he said Lashon Hara about the Jewish people. And he says, look, says the Rambam, if this is the way great people, Moshe, Eliyahu, Yeshayahu, are punished when they condemned the Jewish people, how does this guy have the nerve, the chutzpah, to condemn the Jewish people, to, with one paintbrush, paint everybody who is under the threat of death, who is giving in under the threat of death, and they're not doing it because they're looking to become Muslims. They're not looking to become to do something bad. They're doing it because they're under the threat of death, and they're doing it only bepeh. They're going in and they're saying some. He's saying they're saying. The Rambam goes on, and again, I can't read the whole thing because it's long. He says they're saying some formula, but they don't really believe it. So how can you condemn them and say, and you're saying, he says, I would have kept quiet. The Rambam says, I'm not looking for machloket. But you're saying now that all of their prayers, you're taking the whole nation and your whole groups of people, and you're saying all their prayers now are worthless? How dare you? And he basically says those words, how dare you? And he says even people who were the Rishaim, and we have all kinds of midrashim about people who did one good thing in their lives. It says Nebuchadnezzar HaRasha, who and everybody was he brought them, and Nebuchadnezzar killed and he destroyed the Beis Hamikdash, And it says he did one nice thing. It says, and because of that, he was rewarded because he did one nice thing. It says that in the days also, we just celebrated Purim, in the days of the Jewish people of Haman, it says the Jewish people bowed down to the Tselem. But God just scared them through Haman. He scared them a lot through Haman. He says, because they only did it to show, so he only showed them as if he was going to destroy them. But there's a recognition that if you do something only to show, you're only doing it to show. And therefore, he goes on. And again, I see this. I have some translation just to make it a little easier. How could an ordinary man dare to assail whole communities and their scholars? They have not strayed from the law because of their evil passion, but because they are threatened by swords and blows, while they in their heart revere God and keep his ordination. It is erroneous to maintain that he who has entered a mosque without praying there. That's what he said. Even if you walk into a mosque, you're puzzle without praying there, and later went home and prayed to God, would not find his prayer answered. Eglon, the king of Moab, who oppressed the Israelites, was rewarded for that his descendant from Solomon by his daughter Ruth, right? Eglon Melech Moab, Ruth HaMoabite sat on the throne of the Lord, because when Ehud said to him, I have a message from God, he stood up from his throne. So Eglon Melech Moab, or Russia, was rewarded because one little thing he stood up. So you're telling me that you're puzzling everybody because of one thing? This made you puzzle completely? How dare you say such a thing? Whoever wrote, whoever has yielded to coercion, he wrote, instead of suffering death, has acted badly. The present persecution is differs from previous persecutions, experiences. In former cases, Israelites have been called upon to transgress the law in action. Now we are not asked to render active homage, only to recite an empty formula, which Muslims themselves knew we utter insincerely in order to circumvent their law. Indeed, any Jew who, after uttering the Muslim formula, wishes to observe the 613 precepts may do so without hindrance. And even if under these circumstances, a Jew who surrenders his life in the name of God, he has done nobly and well, and his reward is great before God. But if a man asks me, shall I be slain or other than formula? I answer, utter the formula and live. And it's interesting, we do know, and the Rambam addresses this, that if a person, there are the big three averos, we all learned, where it's Yehareg ve'al ya'avor, that a person is supposed to allow themselves to be killed rather than transgressed. Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayos, and Shvichas Damim. Now again, whether this is a certain things, Avodah Zarah, and whether saying the empty formula for Islam, which as Judith pointed out, may not be Avodah Zarah, whether that falls under the category that one is supposed to give up their lives. Gilui Arayot and Shfichat Damim, one is supposed to give up their lives. But the Rambam makes it abundantly clear that one who doesn't, he says, you know what, if somebody gives up their lives when they're supposed to, you're a tzaddik. But if you don't, you're not a Rasha. Chas v'shalom that someone's a Rasha. He says it so clearly. A person doesn't get the onesh. So if a person did Gilui Arayos or Shvichas Damim or Avodah Zarah, Beis Din will not punish the guy because you did it because you were forced. If a person does something because they were forced, so maybe you're right, under certain circumstances, we're supposed to allow ourselves to be killed rather than to transgress. But if someone doesn't have that strength, and we only, God spare us from such nisyonot, that we should never be in such a situation where God should put us where we have to make that decision. But certainly someone who does not allow themselves to be killed and does in fact transgress over the Isur of Avodah Zarah, Gili Arayas or Shvichas Damim. They're not punished. And what they did was they did through onus because they were forced to, and they're still accepted completely as Jews. And by the way, as an aside, that we say on Yom Kippur, Kol Nidrei night. Do you remember, when we take out the Torah and they say, B'yeshiva shel mala u'b'yeshiva shel mata, anu matirim lehispalel im ha'avaryanim. And this was exactly for this, that this prayer was inserted, that there should be no doubt that anu matirim lehispal, even if those people had to live as secret Jews and on the outside act as avaryanim, then they're still considered Jews, and we're still allowed to daven with them. And chas v'shalom, says the Rambam, to say that their mitzvos are not worth anything and that their prayers are not worth anything. And the Rambam wrote this powerful, powerful letter. And now the Rambam does say something else interesting, which is, there's actually an interesting machloket. The Rambam says, it's something interesting to think about. In a situation where the law is ya'avor ve'al yehareg. Let's say there's, the shlechte goyim say, eat this ham sandwich or I'm going to kill you. And the halacha is you're supposed to eat the ham sandwich, unless it's maybe under certain circumstances. But in general, we say you're supposed to eat the ham sandwich and live, right? Everything is ya'avor v'al yehareg. Let's say somebody's very, very frum, and they say, I know that I'm allowed to eat the ham sandwich, but I'm going to be so religious and so frum, I will not eat the ham sandwich, and I'm going to be killed rather than eat the ham sandwich. So it's an interesting question and discussion whether that's something okay that you did or not. The Rambam says very clearly in this Igeret Hashmad that it is a wrong thing, that one is supposed to live. When you're supposed to live, when the halacha is ya'avor va'al yehareg, then that's the directive to us. Live so that we can do more mitzvos. So the Rambam, if somebody, again, you probably can get a hold of this. I apologize, and I also, I came from it's no excuse, I'm sorry, but I wanted to organize it so at least I could show you some of it in writing. But I'm sure in these days you can, if you want to look at it and look at translations, you can see this Igeret Hashmad. The Rambam certainly, this is known as one of his very, very powerful letters that he wrote. And the fact that he wrote it as a man in his young 20s, where on one hand, and to me, the power that he wrote forcefully against this guy. And at the same time, and he ends with, and again, I'm not reading it for you now, a beautiful love and inclusiveness and a caring for all of Klal Yisrael, which the Rambam showed in his later life also. When he arrived at Egypt, there was a strong Karaite community. And the Karaim did not believe in Torah Baal Peh, and they considered themselves Jews, and they kept things, but in those days there were strong Karaite communities, quite a strong Karaite community in Egypt, powerful. And the Rambam did his best to try to live peacefully with them and bring them into the fold rather than create machlokas. So that vision of a leader who was powerful and strong and stood up, but who stood up not to castigate or condemn, but who stood up for the honor of the people, was something very special. And I'll just end with something which the Rambam writes in Igeret Hashmad, which I've seen this. I heard going through the Igeret Hashmad this time recently. I was reminded of this because I heard some time ago, and I knew the Rambam wrote it, and I just reviewed it again. He writes very briefly that in the time of the Yevanim, one of their gzerot was that the Jewish people couldn't close their front doors, that they couldn't close their front doors. We don't know what the source is for this, where the Rambam gets this. And the Gemara says Shabbos or Chodesh, all the things that the Greeks, that the Yevanim did against the Jews. But that you can't close the front door. What's it all about that you can't close the front door? So I once heard somebody say a beautiful idea, that the Yevanim were not stupid, they were smart. They understood the value of the Jewish family. And the Jewish family is be able to, on one hand, we light the candles for the outside also. So we're not insular, but we have to also recognize that it all begins with the Jewish home. And you create in the Jewish home by being able to close the front door and to create a value system and a love for Hashem and a love for the Jewish people, which we're able to create through closing the door. So this Rambam writes just as an aside, he writes, and this was one of the Gzerot of the Yevanim, that he was writing about the Yevanim, that you can't close the front door. So I'll end on that. It's good to see everybody.
Moshe, I have a question for you. This letter that he was responding to from this anonymous rabbi, do we know whether it was written b'chavana anonymously? Did he just not have the backbone to put his name to it? Or was it lost?
That's a very good question. I don't know the answer to that question. That's interesting that it wouldn't, I don't know. I don't know if a person wouldn't have, you write a letter of conduct. It's funny because the people who put out now the anonymous things, signed by the Rabbanim, it's reminiscent now that you mention it, that people are afraid, they don't want to put, I always said, as a principal of a school, I used to get anonymous letters, they go straight into the
Garbage.
wastebasket. I said, if you're not going to put your name on something, I'm not going to be mityaches to it. If you write something, don't be ashamed to put your name on it. So I don't know. I don't know what the reasoning is. It was, again, he tries to give him some benefit of the doubt, certainly in the way he writes, and he doesn't just go off on him, can't do personal attacks because you don't know who he is, but he does write very, very forcefully.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to say was that a lot of people probably have it on their shelves. It may not be the copy the edition you're referring to, but it's very helpful. I couldn't follow. You were jumping, so I couldn't follow it. But if we're going to continue with it, it would be good to have it in writing.
That's a very good. What you just held up, Sima, is actually because in that edition they actually give very good explanations on the bottom. That this is a nice edition, but I think it's more. That's a very good one. That's an easier one, I think, than this one.
Yeah.
Maybe. Yep. What? Hold on.
Devori, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, it was just an idea. Maybe that the Rambam, maybe what he was, he wanted to castigate the idea, but he didn't want to castigate the person who was saying it. So if he said it, if it was done anonymously, maybe it was just that he didn't want to come out against this person, but against the ideas that this person was espousing. So.
You're a tzaddikus. Yeah, could be.
Hardly. But thank you. Something to aspire to. Thank you.
It could be though. I wouldn't even. It's tzaddikus for even thinking that way. I wouldn't even think that way. But that could be. I'm not sure if I'm. I have a flight for tomorrow night, which I hope I'm on. I don't know what's going to work with the time difference, but I'll work out with Aviva. I think it's like 5 in the morning or 4 in the morning.
Well,
So I'm not sure if I'm going to be on. Thank you. Thank you.
Have a
I see your Ruvain's on. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Have a good
Thank you.
Very
Thank
you.
Safe flight and a good trip.
Yes, amen.
Nasiya Tova.